The shovel bit into the hard Oklahoma earth for the fourth time in 2 years, and Georgia Catherine's hands no longer blistered when she gripped the worn wooden handle. That realization struck her harder than the August sun beating down on her black mourning dress, harder than the preacher's empty words about God's mysterious ways, harder than the sympathetic glances from townspeople who had run out of comforting things to say. She stood alone beside the fresh grave, watching the last of the funeral crowd disperse into the shimmering heat, their dark figures wavering like ghosts against the prairie horizon. Oklahoma City stretched behind her, a collection of weathered buildings and dust-choked dreams in this year of 1882, and she wondered distantly if she had become as dried out and hollow as the land itself. The cemetery sat on a small rise outside town, where the wind never stopped blowing, and the grass grew in stubborn patches between the markers. Georgia had claimed this spot 2 years ago when she buried her husband Thomas. Then came baby Samuel 6 months later, born too early and too weak to survive the winter. Her daughter Margaret followed last spring, taken by scarlet fever before her 5th birthday. And now her son Benjamin, just turned 7, lost to a rattlesnake bite that had turned his small leg black and swollen, despite everything the doctor tried. 4 graves in a neat row, 4 crosses she had hammered into the ground herself, 4 reasons why the women in town whispered that she was cursed, why men tipped their hats but kept their distance, why even the Reverend seemed relieved when the services ended and he could escape her company. Georgia stabbed the shovel into the dirt pile beside Benjamin's grave and left it standing there like a monument to futility. She was 23 years old and felt ancient. The walk back to her small house on the edge of town stretched before her like a journey across a continent. Her boots raised small clouds of dust with each step, and she focused on that rather than the weight pressing against her chest. The weight that made breathing feel like work she was not sure she wanted to continue doing. The house Thomas had built stood silent and accusatory, 2 rooms and a lean-to for the horse she had sold last month to pay for medicine that had not worked. The garden she had planted in spring had withered to brown stalks despite her attempts to haul water from the creek. Everything she touched seemed to die, and she was beginning to think the townspeople were right about the curse. She did not bother lighting a lamp as darkness fell. She sat in Thomas's old chair and stared at nothing until exhaustion finally pulled her under into a sleep full of small hands reaching for her and voices calling her name. Morning came too bright and too loud with birdsong. Georgia forced herself upright and went through the motions of living because she did not know what else to do. She built a fire in the stove, made coffee that tasted like ashes, and tried to remember if she had eaten anything yesterday. The cupboard held a few potatoes, some cornmeal, and a tin of beans. The money Thomas had left was gone, spent on doctors and medicines and coffins. She would need to find work soon, though she could not imagine what kind of work or why it mattered. A knock on the door startled her so badly she dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, and she stared at the spreading puddle as the knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Katherine, you in there?" She did not recognize the voice. Male, with a rough edge that suggested a life spent outdoors. Georgia stepped over the broken cup and opened the door a crack. The man on her porch was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He held his hat in his hands and had the weathered look of someone who worked cattle for a living. She guessed him to be in his mid-20s, though the sun had etched lines around his eyes that made him seem older. He wore dusty trail clothes and had a gun on his hip that he carried with the casual ease of long familiarity. "Mrs. Katherine, name's Kane Cooper. I was passing through town yesterday and heard about your loss. I'm real sorry for your trouble." Georgia waited for him to continue, to explain what he wanted, to ask for something she did not have to give. Kane shifted his weight and glanced past her into the house. "I also heard you might be needing some help around the place. I'm between jobs right now, and I'm handy with repairs and such. Thought maybe we could work out an arrangement." "I cannot pay you." "Did not ask for pay." "Then why?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with suspicion and exhaustion. Kane met her eyes directly. "Because everybody needs help sometimes, and you look about worn down to nothing, if you will pardon me saying so. I am fine. With respect, madam, you are not fine, and there is no shame in admitting it." Georgia felt something crack inside her chest, some last defense she had been holding on to. "I have buried 4 people in 2 years, my husband, my babies. I cannot afford to bury anyone else, and I surely cannot afford to let anyone get close enough that I might have to." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than anything she had said since Benjamin died. Kane did not flinch or offer empty platitudes. He just nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "Then let me help you stop digging," he said quietly. "Let me fix your fence and your roof and whatever else needs fixing. Let me help you plant a garden that will actually grow. You do not have to pay me anything. You do not have to talk to me if you do not want to. But let me help, because I have been where you are, and I know what it feels like to think you are done with living." Something in his voice, some echo of genuine understanding, made Georgia open the door wider. She studied him in the full morning light, noting the weariness that matched her own, the shadow of old pain in his eyes. "You have lost people too." "Yes, madam, more than I care to count." "Then you should know better than to get involved with someone like me. They say I am cursed." Kane's mouth quirked in something that was not quite a smile. "They say a lot of things. Most of it is nonsense spoken by folks who are scared of their own shadows. I make my own judgments about people." Georgia wanted to send him away. She wanted to close the door and return to her dark house and her darker thoughts. But something in his steady gaze, in his calm acceptance of her harsh truths, made her hesitate. "The fence is in the back," she heard herself say. "Whole section came down in the last storm. I have been meaning to fix it. I will take a look at it. There is no food for lunch. I brought my own supplies." She nodded and started to close the door, then paused. "Why were you just passing through?" Kane settled his hat back on his head. "Worked a drive up from Texas, got paid off in Dodge City, and decided to see some country before I signed on with another outfit. Figured Oklahoma was as good a direction as any. And you just happened to hear about me. Small town, people talk. And I asked some questions at the general store when I was buying supplies. Why would you ask questions about me?" Kane looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because when I saw you standing alone at that cemetery yesterday afternoon, you had the look of someone standing on the edge of something deep and dark. And because I know what it is like to stand on that edge, and because I thought maybe if someone had stopped to help me when I needed it, I might have stepped back from that edge a little sooner." Georgia did not know what to say to that, so she just nodded and closed the door. She stood with her back pressed against the wood, listening to his boots cross the porch and descend the steps. Through the window, she watched him walk around the side of the house toward the back fence, moving with the loose-limbed grace of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. She should not have let him stay. She should not have opened the door at all, but it was done now, and she was too tired to undo it. The sound of hammering started an hour later and continued through the morning. Georgia cleaned up the broken coffee cup and forced herself to eat a boiled potato. She sat at the table and tried not to listen to the steady rhythm of work outside her walls. She tried not to think about what it meant to let someone help her, to let someone into even the smallest corner of her carefully guarded solitude. Around noon, the hammering stopped. Georgia tensed, waiting for a knock on the door, but it did not come. After several minutes, she heard the hammering resume farther away, and she realized he had moved to another section of fence. He did not ask her for lunch. He did not ask her for anything. And somehow, that made it harder to maintain her distance, harder to hold on to the conviction that she was better off alone. The afternoon crawled past. Georgia tried to occupy herself with washing clothes, but she could not stop listening to the sounds of repairs happening around her property. Kane worked steadily without breaks, and when the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she heard him gathering his tools. His knock came just as she was trying to decide if she should acknowledge his departure. "Mrs. Katherine, I am heading into town for the night. I will be back in the morning to work on your roof, if that sits all right with you. There are some shingles that need replacing before the next rain." Georgia opened the door. Kane stood in the golden evening light, sweat-stained and dusty, looking tired but satisfied. "You did not have to do all that." "I know, but it needed doing. Where are you staying in town?" "There is a boarding house near the livery. Widow Hartson rents rooms by the night." Georgia knew the place, clean and respectable, which meant it was not cheap. She thought about the money he must be spending to stay there while working for her for free, and the unfairness of it made her chest tighten. "I have a lean-to out back. It is not much, but it would save you the ride into town each day." Kane looked surprised. "I would not want to impose." "You are already imposing. Might as well save yourself some money while you are at it." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Yes, madam. I will bring my gear around tomorrow, then." He left before she could second-guess her offer, riding away on a rangy sorrel gelding that looked as trail-worn as its owner. Georgia watched until he disappeared into the gathering dusk, then went back inside and wondered what she had just set in motion. That night, for the first time since Benjamin died, she did not dream of small hands reaching for her. She dreamed instead of fence posts standing straight and strong against a storm, holding firm no matter how hard the wind blew. Kane returned at dawn with a bedroll and saddlebag slung over his horse. He did not knock or announce himself, just set about caring for his mount in the lean-to before climbing onto the roof with a load of shingles he must have bought in town. Georgia made coffee and actually managed to drink some while listening to him work overhead. Around mid-morning, she carried a cup out to him. He accepted it with a nod of thanks and sat on the roof edge, drinking slowly while surveying her property. "You have good land here," he said. "Creek access, decent soil once you get some water to it. Could run a few head of cattle, grow enough vegetables to sell in town. Could, if I had money for cattle and seed, if I had strength left for planting, if everything I touched did not wither and die." Kane studied her over the rim of his cup. "Things die for lots of reasons. Usually it has nothing to do with touching and everything to do with circumstances beyond anyone's control. You sound like you were trying to convince yourself as much as me." "Maybe I am." He drained the coffee and handed the cup back. "I had a wife and daughter once, Emily and Sarah. We had a homestead up in Kansas, trying to make a go of it on 160 acres of prairie. Second winter, the snow came early and hard. I was out checking on the stock when the storm hit. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the fire had gone out and Emily could not get it relit. She had wrapped Sarah in every blanket we owned and huddled with her trying to keep warm. I found them frozen together. Sarah was 3 years old." Georgia felt the words like a physical blow. "Kane, I am sorry. It was 6 years ago. I blame myself for a long time. Blame myself for bringing them out to that God-forsaken country, for not stocking enough firewood, for being out in the storm when they needed me. Blame myself for surviving when they did not. And I spent the next few years trying real hard to join them, taking risks that should have killed me and feeling angry when they did not. What changed? Got shot during a stampede. Stupid accident, someone's gun went off, and I caught the bullet in my shoulder. I was laid up in some doctor's office in Texas, burning up with fever and infection. And I had this dream. Emily was there, and she was angry. Not sad, not understanding. Angry. She told me I was dishonoring their memory by wasting the life I still had. Told me Sarah would be ashamed to see what I had become. And when I woke up, I knew she was right. The dream version of her, anyway." He paused and looked out at the prairie stretching endlessly around them. "So, I started living again. Not forgetting them, never that. But living despite the fact that they were gone. And some days it was hard as hell. And some days I still felt like giving up. But I kept going because the alternative was spitting on their graves, and I could not do that to them." Georgia felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first she had shed since lowering Benjamin into the ground. "I do not know if I have that strength. You are still here. That takes strength, even if it does not feel like it. I am only here because I do not know how to not be here. That counts too. Some days, just surviving is all you can manage, and that is enough." The tears spilled over then, hot and unexpected. Georgia turned away, but Kane had already seen. She heard him climb down from the roof, heard his boots on the hard ground. She expected him to leave or to offer awkward comfort, but he just stood a few feet away, giving her space while making it clear she was not alone. "I should not have let them name him Benjamin," she choked out. "It was my father's name, and my father died when I was 12. I should have known it was bad luck. Names do not carry curses. Bad things happen to your family, but bad things happen to lots of families out here. It does not mean you caused it." "Then why do I feel like I did?" "Because you are human and you love them, and grief makes us think terrible things about ourselves." Georgia wiped at her face with shaking hands. "Thomas got kicked by a horse. Stupid accident. Could have happened to anyone. But I keep thinking if I had asked him to stay home that day, if I had needed him for something here, he would still be alive. Samuel came too early because I tried to move a heavy trunk by myself, and I felt something tear inside. The doctor said it probably would not have mattered, but I know it did. Margaret got sick because I let her play with the neighbor's children, even though I knew they had been ill. And Benjamin? Benjamin died because I did not check his boots before he put them on. The snake was inside his left boot, and I should have checked. I always checked before, but that morning I was tired and I forgot, and he died because I forgot to check his boots. The words poured out of her in a rush, all the poisonous thoughts she had been carrying alone. Kane listened without interrupting, without trying to talk her out of her guilt. When she finally ran out of words, he said quietly, "You could not have known about the snake. And even if you had checked his boots every day for the rest of your lives, one day something else would have happened that you could not prevent. Because that is the nature of living. We do our best, and sometimes it is not enough. And that is a hard truth, but it is true nonetheless. How do you live with that? How do you wake up every day knowing that everything can be taken away in an instant? You just do, and some days are easier than others. And gradually, if you are lucky, the good days start to outnumber the bad ones. You never stop missing them, but you learn to carry the missing instead of letting it carry you." Georgia looked at him properly for the first time, really seeing him rather than just registering his presence. He had kind eyes despite the hard life evident in every line of his face. And he was looking at her with understanding, not pity. Understanding was so much harder to bear than pity. "Thank you for telling me about Emily and Sarah. Figured you should know you are not alone in this. Figured maybe it would help to talk to someone who has been through it. Does it ever stop hurting? No, but it stops being the only thing you feel." She nodded and wiped her face again. "I should let you get back to work. I am sorry for falling apart like that. Do not apologize for being human, and I am not in any hurry. The roof will be there whenever I get back to it." But Georgia needed space to collect herself, so she took her empty coffee cup and retreated into the house. She stood at the window, watching Kane climb back onto the roof and resume his work, and she tried to imagine a future where the grief was not the only thing she felt. It seemed impossible, but Kane had survived his losses. Maybe, eventually, she could survive hers too. The days developed a rhythm. Kane worked on the seemingly endless list of repairs the property needed, while Georgia slowly emerged from her fog of grief. He fixed the roof, rebuilt the chicken coop that had collapsed last spring, and repaired the porch steps that had been threatening to give way. He worked without complaint through heat and wind, and gradually Georgia found herself looking forward to their brief interactions. He did not push for conversation, but when they did talk, she found him easy to be around. He spoke about his travels, about the cattle drives, and the country he had seen, and his stories gave her a window into a larger world beyond her small circle of loss. One afternoon, in late August, Kane appeared at the door with a crate of chickens. "Bought these from a farmer east of town. Figured you could use the eggs." Georgia stared at the chickens, then at Kane. "I told you I cannot pay you. And I told you I was not asking for pay. Consider them an investment in your future egg supply. I am getting tired of beans for breakfast." Despite herself, Georgia felt something close to a smile tug at her mouth. "You are insufferable." "Yes, madam. Now, should I put them in the coop or just let them roost on the porch?" She shook her head, but helped him get the chickens settled. They were good layers, plump and healthy, and by the next morning, she had 4 eggs. It was such a small thing gathering those eggs, but it felt like something shifting, like a tiny crack letting light into a dark room. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of autumn. Kane planted a late garden, turning over the soil and working in manure he hauled from town. Georgia found herself helping despite her earlier conviction that everything she touched would die. They worked side by side in the garden, not talking much, but comfortable in the shared labor. "Why are you really here?" she asked one afternoon, while they were weeding between rows of lettuce and radishes. "You could have moved on to another job weeks ago." Kane sat back on his heels and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Told you why the first day. You needed help." "That is not all of it, though." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "No, I suppose it is not. Truth is, I have been drifting for 6 years now, moving from one job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. And I am tired, Georgia. Tired of running from ghosts, tired of waking up in different towns and not caring which one it is. And when I saw you at that cemetery, I recognized something in you, someone else who was tired of running, and I thought maybe we could help each other stop." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. "I do not know that I am ready to stop running. Do not have to know yet. Just have to be willing to consider the possibility. Georgia looked at the neat rows of vegetables, at the chickens scratching in their coop, at the house with its straight fence and repaired roof. Kane had given her all of this without asking anything in return, and more than that, he had given her the space to grieve and the understanding that came from walking the same dark path. "I am considering it," she said softly. Kane's smile was genuine and warm. "That is all I am asking." They finished the weeding and went their separate ways for the evening, but something had shifted between them. Some unspoken acknowledgement that they were moving towards something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. The nightmares came less frequently now. Georgia still woke sometimes with tears on her face and Benjamin's name on her lips, but more often she slept peacefully through the night. She began to take more care with her appearance, putting up her blonde hair properly and wearing dresses that were not black. She caught Kane looking at her with appreciation one morning, and the warmth in his eyes made her feel something she had thought was dead inside her. October painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The garden produced more vegetables than Georgia could use, so she started selling the surplus in town. The money was not much, but it was something, a beginning. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, Kane knocked on her door with a venison haunch over his shoulder. "Went hunting this morning. Figured we could both use some fresh meat." Georgia invited him in for the first time since he had started working on the property. He looked around the small house with interest, taking in the simple furniture and the empty spots where children's things had once been. "I put their toys away," Georgia said, following his gaze. "I could not bear to look at them, but I could not bear to throw them away either. They are in a trunk under the bed." "That makes sense. You do what you need to do." She built up the fire and put coffee on while Kane butchered the venison with practiced efficiency. They worked together to prepare a meal, and Georgia realized it was the first time she had cooked for anyone other than herself since the funeral, the first time she had shared her space with another adult in months. They ate at the small table, and the conversation flowed easier than it ever had before. Kane told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to rope and ride from his father, who had worked as a ranch hand. Georgia talked about her childhood in Tennessee, about coming west with Thomas when they married, and the dreams they had shared of building something lasting. "Do you regret coming west?" Kane asked. Georgia considered the question carefully. "I regret the things I lost, but I do not regret the life we tried to build. Thomas was a good man, and we had some happy years before everything went wrong. And my children, for however briefly they were here, they were loved and wanted. So, no, I do not regret the choices that led me here. I just wish they had not cost so much." That is a good way to look at it, honest. I am trying to be more honest these days. Lying to myself about how I felt was not helping anything. I noticed you have been doing better, sleeping more, eating more. You have more color in your face. Georgia felt a blush rise in her cheeks. "You have been watching me?" "Hard not to when I'm around every day. And I wanted to make sure you were actually healing, not just pretending for my benefit." "I think I am healing, slowly, thanks in no small part to you." Kane reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch was warm and solid and sent a flutter through her stomach that she had not felt in years. "You are doing the work. I am just here to make it a little easier." Georgia turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that for a long moment, connected across the table, and she felt something settle into place inside her. Some recognition that she was allowed to feel this, allowed to want this, allowed to move forward even though she would always carry her losses with her. "Kane, I need to tell you something." "All right. I am afraid of letting myself care about someone again, afraid of losing you too. And I know that is not fair to you, to hold back because of fear. But I do not know how to do this any other way." Kane squeezed her hand gently. "Georgia, I am afraid too. I am afraid of messing this up, of pushing too hard or not hard enough. I am afraid that I am reading things wrong and you are only being kind because I have been helpful. But I am more afraid of walking away without at least trying. So, how about we just agree to be afraid together and see where it leads? Together sounds good. Then together it is." He left shortly after, but the warmth of his touch lingered on her hand, long into the night. Georgia lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. But underneath it all was a current of something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. Hope. The next morning, Kane suggested they ride into town together. Georgia had been avoiding Oklahoma City beyond her absolutely necessary trips for supplies, but she agreed. They rode side by side on Kane's sorrel, Georgia sitting behind him with her arms around his waist, and the closeness felt natural rather than awkward. The town was busy with Saturday morning activity. People stopped to stare at them, at the widow Katherine riding with the mysterious cowboy who had been working her land. Georgia felt the weight of their judgment and curiosity, but found she did not care as much as she expected. Let them talk. They had been talking about her for 2 years already. They stopped at the general store for supplies. Mr. Peterson behind the counter raised his eyebrows when he saw them together, but was professional in his dealings. Georgia bought flour and sugar and coffee, while Kane selected ammunition and a new set of horseshoes. "Heard you have been helping out at the Katherine place," Mr. Peterson said to Kane while wrapping their purchases. "Yes, sir. Been doing some repairs and such." "That is mighty charitable of you." "Not charity, just helping a neighbor." Mr. Peterson's wife emerged from the back room, her eyes sharp with gossip. "Well, I think it is wonderful that dear Georgia has found a friend. She has had such terrible luck, poor thing. Though I do hope people do not get the wrong idea, you being unmarried and staying out at her place." Georgia felt her face heat with embarrassment and anger, but Kane spoke before she could. "Mrs. Peterson, I can assure you everything is entirely proper. Mrs. Katherine is a lady, and I treat her as such, and if anyone in town has concerns about her reputation, they can bring them to me directly." His tone was pleasant but held an edge of steel that made Mrs. Peterson step back. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and pushed their packages across the counter. "I am sure no one means any disrespect. Small town, people talk, you know how it is." "I do know how it is, and I know that Mrs. Katherine has been through enough without adding unkind gossip to her burdens. So perhaps folks could focus on their own business and leave her in peace." They left the store with their supplies, and Georgia waited until they were outside to speak. "You did not have to defend me like that." "Yes, I did. I will not stand by while people tear you down with insinuation and rumor. You are going to make yourself unpopular in this town." Kane loaded their packages onto his horse. "I have been unpopular in plenty of towns. Does not bother me much." Georgia felt a surge of affection so strong it nearly knocked her breathless. "Kane Cooper, you are either the bravest man I have ever met or the most foolish." "Probably a bit of both." He grinned at her, and she found herself grinning back. They completed their errands and rode back to her property in comfortable silence. The autumn sun was warm on their backs, and the prairie stretched around them in endless rolling waves. Georgia rested her cheek against Kane's shoulder and let herself enjoy the moment without overthinking it. That night, Kane stayed for dinner again, and the night after that, and the one after that. It became their routine, cooking together and eating together, and talking long into the evening. Sometimes they discussed the past, their lost loved ones, and the grief they carried. More often they talked about the present and the future, about small improvements to the property and plans for spring planting. One evening in mid-October, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Kane said, "I have been thinking about staying on more permanent-like, if you would be agreeable to it." George's heart jumped. "What exactly does permanent mean?" "Means I would like to stop drifting, put down roots, build something lasting, here, if you will have me." "As what? My hired hand? My friend?" Kane turned to look at her, his face serious in the starlight. "As whatever you would let me be, friend at minimum, but I am hoping for more than that, if you are ready." "Kane, I do not know if I am ready for more. I am still grieving. I am still scared of losing someone else I care about." "I know, and I am not asking you to stop grieving or stop being scared. I am just asking for a chance to be here while you work through it. I am asking for the possibility of something more when you are ready." Georgia studied his face, the honest emotion in his eyes, the patience in his expression. He was not pushing or demanding, just offering himself and leaving the choice to her. "I care about you," she said slowly. "More than I thought I would be capable of caring about anyone again. And that terrifies me. But it also makes me feel alive in a way I have not felt in a long time. So, yes, stay. Stay and let us see where this goes. But you have to be patient with me. I am going to be scared and probably difficult." Kane's smile was soft and genuine. "I have been called patient before, and I can handle difficult. Hell, I worked cattle drives for 6 years. Nothing you can throw at me will be worse than 3,000 longhorns and a lightning storm." Georgia laughed, and it felt wonderful. Fair enough, so what happens now? Now we keep doing what we have been doing, living day by day, working together, getting to know each other, and when you are ready for more, you let me know. What if I am never ready for more? Then I will still consider myself lucky to have you as a friend. But Georgia, I do not think you are giving yourself enough credit. You are stronger than you know, and you are already ready for more than you think you are. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that she could open her heart again without inviting disaster. But the fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest. Kane seemed to sense her internal struggle. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers like he had done at dinner weeks ago. One day at a time. That is all either of us can manage. One day at a time, and we will figure the rest out as we go. One day at a time, Georgia repeated. It sounded manageable when he said it like that. They sat together in the darkness, hands clasped, and listened to the night sounds of the prairie. An owl called from somewhere near the creek. The chickens settled in their coop with soft clucking sounds. The wind rustled through the dry grass in an endless whisper. And for the first time since Thomas died, Georgia felt like she might actually have a future worth living. November brought colder weather and the first light snows. Kane moved his gear into the house, taking over the small second room that had been the children's bedroom. Georgia had packed away their things weeks earlier, and while it still hurt to see someone else occupying that space, it also felt right. The house needed life in it. It needed to be more than a monument to loss. They fell into an easy domesticity. Kane handled the heavier outdoor work, while Georgia managed the house and the chickens and the preserving of vegetables for winter. They cooked together most evenings, and Kane proved surprisingly capable in the kitchen for a man who had been living rough for years. My mother insisted all her children learn to cook, he explained one night while making biscuits. Said she was not raising sons who would starve the minute she was not around to feed them. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, died when I was 16. Fever took her quick. My pa followed her a year later. Just lost the will to live, I think. Do you have siblings? Had. 2 brothers and a sister. Lost track of them after Pa died. We all scattered to the winds. I think about looking for them sometimes, but I would not even know where to start. Georgia needed bread dough and thought about family, about the ties that connected people and the ways those ties could fray and break. Would you want to find them, if you could? Kane considered while cutting out biscuits with a tin cup. Maybe. Part of me would like to know they are all right, that they made lives for themselves, but part of me is afraid to find out they are not all right. Or worse, that they are all right and just do not care to reconnect with the brother they left behind. That is understandable. Family is complicated even when everyone is still alive and present. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, then sat down to eat the simple meal they had prepared. The wind howled outside, rattling the newly repaired shutters, but inside the house was warm and full of good smells. This feels like home, Kane said quietly. I have not had that feeling in a long time. Georgia felt warmth spread through her chest. It is starting to feel like home again for me, too. For a while, this house was just a place I existed, but it is becoming something more now. Because you are letting yourself live again instead of just existing. Because you are helping me remember what living feels like. Kane reached across the table and took her hand. It had become a frequent gesture between them, this simple connection. Georgia had stopped questioning it and just let herself enjoy the comfort it brought. Georgia, I want to kiss you. The words hung in the air between them, direct and honest. Georgia's heart raced. She had known this moment would come eventually, but it still caught her off guard. I want that too, she admitted, but I am scared. Of me? Of what it means. Kissing you would make this real, in a way it has not been yet. And making it real means I could lose you. And I am not sure I would survive losing someone else I love. Kane stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. Georgia Katherine, look at me. She met his eyes, those creek water eyes that had become so familiar and dear. You could lose me, he said. That is true. I could get kicked by a horse or shot by outlaws or struck by lightning. Any number of terrible things could happen, but they could also not happen. I could live to be 80 and die peacefully in my sleep. We do not get guarantees in this life. All we get is right now, this moment, and the choice to either embrace it or run from it. And I am tired of running. I am tired of letting fear make my choices for me. I am tired too, Georgia whispered. "So tired of being afraid." "Then stop. Just for tonight, just for right now, stop being afraid and let yourself feel what you feel." Georgia cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palms. She looked at this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. This man who had seen her at her worst and stayed anyway. And she made a choice. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But Kane responded with gentle intensity, his arms coming around her to pull her closer. The kiss deepened, and Georgia felt something break open inside her. Not breaking in a painful way, but breaking like dawn breaks, like spring breaks winter's hold. Breaking into light and warmth and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Georgia rested her forehead against Kane's. "I am still scared." "I know, but you kissed me anyway. That is brave as hell, Georgia." She laughed shakily. "I do not feel brave. I feel terrified and exhilarated and confused all at once." "That sounds about right for falling in love." Georgia pulled back to look at him. "Is that what this is?" "For me it is. Has been for a while now, if I'm being honest. But I did not want to push you before you were ready. I think I am falling in love with you too. I think I have been for weeks. I was just too scared to admit it." Kane smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Then we are falling together. That is good, safer that way." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other on the kitchen floor while the wind howled outside. And Georgia felt the last of her walls crumble. She was still scared. She would probably always be scared. But Kane was right. She was tired of letting fear make her choices. That night, Kane kissed her goodnight at the door to his room and went to bed alone without question or complaint. Georgia appreciated that more than she could say. He was giving her time, letting her set the pace, and that patience made her trust him even more. She lay in her own bed and touched her lips, still feeling the echo of his kiss. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but alongside it now was something new, love, tentative and fragile and real. December arrived with heavier snows and freezing temperatures. Kane and Georgia were snowed in for 3 days during a particularly fierce storm, and the forced closeness pushed their relationship forward in ways neither had anticipated. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and quirks and dreams. They cooked together and read together and simply existed together, and Georgia found it easier to breathe with each passing day. One evening, while the snow piled up outside and the fire crackled in the stove, Kane said, "I want to marry you." Georgia looked up from the socks she was darning. "Is that a question or a statement?" "Both. I want to marry you, and I am asking if you would consider it." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to think clearly. "Kane, we have only known each other a few months. I know, but I also know what I feel, and I know what I want. I want to build a life with you. I want to work this land and raise cattle, and maybe, if you are willing, have children someday. I want to grow old with you and make new memories to stand alongside the old ones." "Children," the word caught in her throat. "I do not know if I could survive losing another child. And we might never have to, but if we did, God forbid, we would survive it together, because that is what people who love each other do. They carry the hard things together, so the weight is not so crushing." Georgia set down her darning. "I am 23 years old, and I have buried a husband and 3 children. What if I really am cursed? What if being with me puts you in danger?" Kane moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Georgia, there is no curse. There is just bad luck and circumstances and the harsh reality of life on the frontier. And yes, loving someone is a risk, but not loving someone is a bigger risk because it means choosing to live half a life. And I am done with half measures. I want all of you, grief and fear and scars included, and I am offering all of me in return. What if I say no? Then I will respect that. I will stay if you want me to stay, or I will leave if you need me to leave. But either way, my feelings will not change. I love you, Georgia. I am in love with you. And whether you marry me or not, that is going to be true." Georgia felt tears streaming down her face. "You should not love me. I am broken and sad, and I wake up crying some nights. I know, and I love you anyway. All of you, broken pieces included." She looked at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had been too afraid to speak. This man who had fixed her fences and her roof, and somehow started fixing her heart. "I love you too," she said, "and I am terrified by how much I love you. But I'm also tired of letting terror win. So, yes, Kane Cooper, yes, I will marry you." Kane pulled her into his arms and held her tight. Georgia buried her face in his shoulder and cried. But these were different tears. These were tears of release and relief and cautious joy. "When?" Kane asked when she had calmed down. "Soon, before I lose my nerve." He laughed. "How about after the storm passes? We can ride into town and find the Reverend." "That sounds perfect." They were married 3 days later in the Reverend's small office with Mrs. Peterson and her husband as witnesses. Georgia wore her best dress, dark blue calico that was not black, and Kane wore his cleanest clothes and a new string tie he had bought for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and simple, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Kane kissed her with a tenderness that made her believe in second chances. The Petersons threw together an impromptu celebration at the general store, inviting half the town. People who had whispered about the cursed widow now came forward with congratulations and gifts. Georgia accepted their well wishes with grace, though she could not quite forgive their earlier judgment. But Kane was charming and gracious to everyone, and gradually she relaxed into the celebration. They rode back to their property as the sun set, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of pink and gold. Kane lifted her down from the horse and then, to her surprise, swept her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It is tradition. We have both been living here for months." "Does not matter. Today we are starting fresh." He carried her into the house and set her down gently in front of the fire. They stood looking at each other in the flickering light, suddenly shy despite the months of growing intimacy. "I am nervous," Georgia admitted. "Me too." "You are?" "It has been a long time for me, and I want this to be right for you." Georgia reached up and touched his face. "Just be gentle with me. Be patient. That is all I need." Kane kissed her softly. "I can do that." He led her to his room, which was now their room, and they undressed each other slowly in the lamplight. Kane was patient and gentle and attentive, and Georgia let herself feel without overthinking. It was different than it had been with Thomas. Not better or worse, just different. Its own thing, separate and new. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Georgia felt more at peace than she had in years. This was her life now. This man, this house, this second chance she had not thought she deserved. "I love you, Mrs. Cooper." "I love you too, husband." They fell asleep wrapped around each other while the wind whispered outside and the fire burned low in the stove. Winter passed into spring. Kane bought 3 head of cattle with money he had saved from his cowboy days, and they began building a small herd. The garden thrived under their joint care, and they sold eggs and vegetables in town regularly. The property slowly transformed from a place of mourning into a working homestead. In March, Georgia realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, then told Kane one morning over breakfast, "I think I am pregnant." Kane's face went through a series of emotions too quick to catalog, finally settling on cautious joy. "Are you certain?" "Fairly certain. All the signs are there." "How do you feel about it?" Georgia had to think about that. Scared, excited, hopeful, terrified, all of it at once. Kane came around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "We are going to be all right. Whatever happens, we will face it together. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose this baby too? Then we will grieve together and keep going. But Georgia, you cannot live your life expecting disaster. Sometimes good things happen. Sometimes babies are born healthy and grow up strong. We have to believe that is possible." Georgia squeezed his hands. "I want to believe that. I am trying to believe that. That is all anyone can do. Try." The pregnancy progressed without complications. Georgia was sick in the mornings for the first few months, but Kane handled it with patience and humor, bringing her crackers and water and holding her hair when needed. He was attentive without being smothering, and Georgia found herself relaxing into the experience rather than bracing for disaster. In May, they felt the baby kick for the first time. Georgia was hanging laundry when she felt the flutter in her belly. She called for Kane, and he came running, worried something was wrong. When she placed his hand on her stomach and he felt the movement, his eyes filled with tears. That is our baby. That is our baby." They stood together in the spring sunshine, hands on her growing belly, and let themselves hope. Summer brought heat and hard work. The cattle were thriving, the garden was producing abundantly, and Georgia's belly swelled with new life. She felt better than she had expected, strong and capable despite her size. Kane doted on her shamelessly, insisting she rest more and work less, but Georgia refused to be treated like an invalid. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon when he tried to take the water bucket from her. "I know that, but humor me. I am a first-time father, and I am terrified of something going wrong." Georgia softened. "I am terrified too, but we cannot live in fear. You taught me that." "I know what I taught you. Does not mean I have to like it when you ignore sensible precautions. Carrying water is not ignoring precautions. It is living my life." They bickered about it good-naturedly, and Georgia realized this was what marriage looked like. Not grand gestures and perfect moments, but everyday disagreements and compromises and caring enough to worry. It was ordinary and wonderful, and she treasured it. In August, as her due date approached, Kane began sleeping lightly, waking at her every movement. Georgia tried to tease him about it, but she was secretly touched by his vigilance. He was preparing himself to be a father, and she could see how seriously he took the responsibility. On a hot afternoon in late August, exactly 1 year after Kane had first appeared at her door, Georgia felt the first contraction. She was in the garden when it hit, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. She straightened up and waited for it to pass, then walked calmly to the house. "Kane, I think the baby is coming." Kane appeared in the doorway, his face going pale. "Now? Are you sure?" "Fairly sure. You might want to ride into town and fetch the midwife." "I am not leaving you alone." "Kane, one of us has to get Mrs. Henderson, and I am in no condition to ride." He looked torn, clearly terrified to leave her, but knowing she was right. Finally he nodded. "I will be as quick as I can. Do not have that baby until I get back." "I will do my best." He kissed her hard and fast, then ran for his horse. Georgia watched him gallop toward town, then went inside to prepare. She had done this 3 times before. She knew what to expect, knew the pain that was coming, but this time felt different. This time she had hope. Mrs. Henderson arrived within the hour, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered most of the babies in Oklahoma City. She examined Georgia and pronounced everything progressing normally. "First babies can take a while," she said. "Best get comfortable." Kane hovered anxiously, clearly wanting to help, but not knowing what to do. Mrs. Henderson finally shooed him out of the bedroom, but he stationed himself just outside the door, where Georgia could hear him pacing. The labor went on through the afternoon and into the evening. Georgia had forgotten how much it hurt, how consuming the pain could be. But between contractions, Kane would appear at the door asking if she needed anything, and his presence gave her strength. Night had fallen when Mrs. Henderson announced it was time to push. Georgia bore down, focusing all her energy on bringing this baby into the world. And finally, after one last tremendous effort, she heard the cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced. "A healthy baby boy." Georgia sobbed with relief as Mrs. Henderson placed the squalling infant on her chest. He was red and wrinkled and perfect, and she could not believe he was real. Kane appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears. "Is he all right? Is Georgia all right?" "Both are fine," Mrs. Henderson assured him. "Come meet your son." Kane approached the bed like he was walking on sacred ground. He stared down at the baby with wonder and terror in equal measure. "He is so small." "He is perfect," Georgia said. "Kane, we have a son. We have a son." Kane touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and the infant wrapped his fingers around it. Kane made a choked sound and had to look away for a moment. Mrs. Henderson finished her work efficiently, then left them alone with instructions to call if they needed anything. The baby nursed hungrily, and Georgia marveled at the simple miracle of it. "What should we name him?" Kane asked. Georgia had been thinking about this. "I would like to name him after someone new, not my father or your father or anyone we lost. Someone who represents the future, not the past." "That makes sense. What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking Matthew. It means gift from God, and that is what he is." Kane smiled. "Matthew Cooper. I like it. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the world." The baby yawned and nestled against George's chest, already falling asleep. She looked at Kane, at the love and fear and wonder in his face, and felt complete in a way she had never expected to feel again. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it. I just paced and worried. We did it together, all of it. And we are going to keep doing it together." Kane kissed her forehead. "Every day for the rest of our lives." The first few weeks with Matthew were exhausting and wonderful. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, but Georgia still found herself checking on him constantly. She would wake in the night just to make sure he was still breathing, and Kane did the same. They were both terrified of losing this precious new life. But gradually, as days turned to weeks and Matthew continued to thrive, they began to relax. Fall arrived with its usual display of color. Kane harvested the garden, while Georgia minded the baby. They had fallen into a rhythm, trading off responsibilities and supporting each other through the challenges of new parenthood. Matthew was a month old when Georgia finally allowed herself to believe he was going to survive, that they were going to survive. One October evening, she found Kane in the barn checking on the cattle. Matthew was asleep in a sling against her chest, and she leaned against the stall door watching her husband work. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" she asked. Kane looked up from examining a cow's hoof. "Which part?" "You said you would help me stop digging graves." "I remember. You did that. You saved my life, Kane. I was ready to give up before you came along, ready to just wait for whatever tragedy was going to claim me next. But you showed me how to live again, how to hope again." Kane set down the cow's hoof and came to stand in front of her. He touched Matthew's sleeping head gently, then cupped Georgia's face in his work-roughened hands. "You saved yourself, Georgia. I just stuck around long enough for you to remember you were worth saving. And you saved me too, if we are keeping score. Gave me a reason to stop drifting. Gave me a home and a family and a purpose. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I know the feeling, but we made a choice to be brave, remember? To love each other despite the risks. And look what that choice gave us." He touched Matthew's head again, and their son stirred but did not wake. Georgia felt tears of gratitude welling up. She had never imagined this future for herself. Never imagined standing in a barn with a husband and a healthy baby, talking about hope and bravery and love. "What do you think happens next?" she asked. "Next we keep building, keep growing, maybe add more cattle, maybe have more children if we are blessed. We work hard and love hard and appreciate every single day we get together. That sounds perfect. It will not always be easy. There will be hard times and losses and days when we feel like giving up. I know, but we will face them together. Together." Kane kissed her softly, careful not to disturb the baby between them. Always together. They stood in the quiet barn, the three of them. And Georgia thought about the graves on the hill outside town. She would always carry those losses with her: Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Benjamin. They were part of her story, part of who she had become. But they were not the end of her story. They were not even the most important part anymore. The most important part was standing right here, in this barn, with this man, holding this baby, building a life worth living, one day at a time. Winter came again, but this time it brought joy instead of sorrow. Matthew's first Christmas was celebrated with neighbors who had become friends, with food and laughter and the warmth of community. Kane had built a cradle for the baby, and it rocked gently beside their bed each night. They were a family, complete and whole, and Georgia finally understood what it meant to be happy. In January, on the anniversary of their first year together, Kane gave her a gift. It was a small wooden cross, beautifully carved with flowers and vines. "For the graves," he explained. "I thought maybe you would want to replace those old crosses with something more permanent, something beautiful." Georgia held the cross and felt tears spill over. "You made this?" "Made 4 of them, one for each grave. I know you still go out there sometimes to visit. Thought they deserved something better than those rough markers. Kane, this is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me. They are part of your history. They deserve to be remembered properly." That afternoon, they bundled Matthew up and rode out to the cemetery. Together, they replaced the old crosses with the new ones. Kane had carved each name with care, and Georgia traced the letters with her fingers. "I will always miss you," she said to the graves. "But I am living now, really living. And I hope wherever you are, You are at peace knowing that I found happiness again." Kane stood beside her with Matthew in his arms, and Georgia felt a sense of completion. She had survived. She had found love again. She had built a new life from the ashes of her old one. And she was done digging graves. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Matthew grew from baby to toddler to boy, curious and bright and full of energy. When he was 2, Georgia gave birth to a daughter they named Katherine. 2 years after that, another son they named Thomas, after Georgia's first husband. Kane had insisted on the name, saying it was right to honor the man who had loved Georgia first. The homestead prospered. Kane's small herd grew into a respectable operation, and they added a proper barn and a second room to the house. Georgia's garden became famous in Oklahoma City for producing the finest vegetables in the county. They worked hard and loved hard and built something lasting. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch their children play in the yard. Matthew would chase Katherine around the chicken coop, while baby Thomas toddled after them both. And Georgia would lean against Kane's shoulder and marvel at how full her life had become. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if you had just kept riding that day?" she asked one evening. "Sometimes. But then I look at all this, and I know I made the right choice. The only choice, really. I almost sent you away. I know, but you did not. You were brave enough to let me stay. Brave enough to let me help. You helped me learn to live again, to hope again, to love again." Kane kissed the top of her head. "And you gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to believe in second chances." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie. The land that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving had become home. The town that had whispered about curses now spoke of the Coopers with respect and even admiration. And the widow who had buried too many had learned to plant and nurture and grow instead of just digging graves. Matthew ran up to the porch, breathless and laughing. "Papa, can you teach me to rope tomorrow? I want to be a cowboy like you." Kane pulled his son onto his lap. "I can teach you to rope, but being a cowboy is about more than just working cattle, son. It is about being honest and working hard and taking care of the people you love. Like how you take care of Mama and me and Katherine and Thomas." "Exactly like that." Matthew considered this seriously, then nodded. "Then I want to be a cowboy like you." Georgia watched her husband and son together and felt her heart swell with love. This was what happiness looked like, not the absence of pain or loss, but the presence of love and purpose and connection. She had learned that lesson the hard way, but it had stuck. Katherine climbed onto the porch and demanded to be picked up. Georgia lifted her daughter into her lap and breathed in the sweet smell of her hair. Inside the house, Thomas was fussing for his evening meal. The chickens were settling in their coop for the night. The cattle were lowing in the distance. This was her life, full and complicated and sometimes difficult, but always, always worth living. Years later, when Matthew was grown and running the homestead with his own wife and children, when Katherine had married a teacher and moved to the new town, growing up 10 miles west, when Thomas was learning his trade as a blacksmith in Oklahoma City, Georgia and Kane would sit on that same porch and remember. 50 years, Kane would say, shaking his head in wonder. 50 years since I knocked on your door. 50 years since you saved my life. We saved each other, Georgia. That is how it works when you love someone. They were old by then, silver-haired and bent with age. But their love had only deepened with time, weathering hardships and celebrating joys. They had buried Georgia's mother and Kane's sister, who they finally tracked down after years of searching. They had survived drought and disease and economic panic. They had seen Oklahoma change from wild territory to settled state, had watched civilization creep across the prairie they had once had mostly to themselves. Through it all, they had held on to each other. Through every storm and every sunny day, they had been partners in the truest sense, building together, grieving together, loving together. On a soft spring morning in 1932, Georgia woke to find Kane had passed peacefully in his sleep. He was 78 years old and had lived a full, good life. But the pain of losing him was still sharp, still terrible. She sat beside his body and held his hand and wept for the man who had taught her how to live again. But this time, the grief did not consume her. This time, she had a family around her. Matthew and Katherine and Thomas and their children and grandchildren all gathered to mourn and remember and celebrate the life of a good man. And while Georgia mourned deeply, she also knew she would survive this loss as she had survived the others. Because Kane had taught her how. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by family and love. And when her time came, she went peacefully, ready to join the husband who had given her a second chance at life. They buried her beside Kane on the hill overlooking the homestead they had built together, and the whole town came out to pay respects to the woman who had survived so much and loved so well. The story of Georgia and Kane became legend in Oklahoma City. People told it to their children and grandchildren as an example of what true love looked like, how two broken people had found each other and built something beautiful from their shared pain, how courage and hope and commitment could transform tragedy into triumph. And on the hill outside town, 5 graves stood in a row, 4 small crosses for the children and husband Georgia had lost first, and 2 larger stones for Georgia and Kane, side by side forever, their names carved with flowers and vines, a testament to survival and second chances and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The homestead remained in the Cooper family for generations. Matthew's children and grandchildren worked the land and raised cattle and kept the story alive. They would take their own children to the graves on the hill and tell them about the widow who had buried too many, and the cowboy who had helped her stop digging, about how love and patience and hope could overcome even the darkest grief. And the land that had once witnessed so much sorrow became a place of joy and life and continuation. The garden Georgia had planted grew wild, but beautiful. The house Kane had repaired stood strong through decades of weather, and the legacy they had built together endured long after they were both gone. Because some love stories do not end with death. Some love stories become part of the earth and sky, woven into the very fabric of a place. And when the wind blew across the Oklahoma prairie, carrying the scent of wild grass and distant rain, people swore they could still feel the presence of Georgia and Kane, still feel their love, strong and steady and eternal. The widow had buried too many, but she had also loved and been loved. She had survived and thrived and built a legacy that would last long beyond her own life. And the cowboy who had stopped to help a grieving stranger had found his own redemption in giving her hope. Together, they had proven that second chances were possible, that love could bloom even in the hardest soil, and that choosing to be brave was always worth it. Their story became a beacon for others facing their own grief and loss, a reminder that darkness was not forever, that pain could coexist with joy, and that letting someone help did not mean weakness, but strength. And while their bodies returned to the earth they had worked so hard, their spirits lived on in the lives they had touched and the family they had created. On certain summer evenings when the light slanted golden across the prairie and the air hung heavy with heat and possibility, you could almost see them, 2 figures standing together on the porch of the old Cooper homestead, watching the sun set over land they had claimed and tamed and loved. The widow and the cowboy, forever together, forever home. And the graves on the hill stood as markers not of death, but of survival, not of ending, but of beginning. 4 crosses for those who had gone before, and 2 stones for those who had found each other in the aftermath of loss and built something beautiful from the ruins. Georgia Katherine Cooper had buried too many, but she had also lived fully and loved deeply and found happiness when she thought it was impossible. And Kane Cooper had stopped drifting and put down roots and become the man he was always meant to be. Together, they had created a love story for the ages, proof that even in the wild and unforgiving West, hope and healing were always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. The end of their story was really just a beginning, because the family they created continued on, generation after generation, carrying forward the lessons Georgia and Kane had learned the hard way. That love was worth the risk, that second chances existed for those willing to take them, that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart, and that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone who had lost everything was simply to stay and help them remember why living mattered. In the Oklahoma earth, under the endless sky, the widow and the cowboy found their final rest, but their love remained, eternal and unbreakable, a testament to the power of choosing hope over despair, of choosing life over mere existence, of choosing love despite the terrible risk of loss. And in that choice, they had found everything that mattered: home, family, purpose, and each other. The story of Georgia and Kane would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to be brave in the face of loss, to open their hearts despite past pain, to believe that happiness could be found even after the darkest tragedy. Because if a widow who had buried too many and a cowboy who had lost everything could find love and build a life together, then anyone could. All it took was courage, patience, and the willingness to let someone help you stop digging and start living again.